25 years after the release of Terminator 2, Linda Hamilton and James Cameron returned to the Terminator franchise. So is it more big budget fan fiction, or is this a worthy sequel to Terminator 2? Let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your take on Terminator Dark Fate. This is a spoiler-free review, so if you're gonna talk spoilers down below in the comment section, put big, gigantic spoiler warnings so none of the big surprises in the film are ruined for someone that hasn't seen the film yet. So Gabriel Luna, the new Terminator, was actually in attendance at my screening. He's from Austin, so at this showing, he had invited his friends and his family and all these people he'd known a long time. And then after the movie, he was interviewed by director Robert Rodriguez, who is also from Austin and who has worked with him before. So it was a neat little experience. He told some amazing stories afterwards, especially stuff about Linda Hamilton and Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was very cool. With all of that said, let's get started talking about the good. And right off the bat, of the sequel since Terminator 2, this is the one that feels tonally right. It feels like a continuation of what James Cameron established. It's a dangerous world. The humor flows organically. It's not big joke setups. You don't have Arnold putting on silly glasses or making big grins, but there is kind of a humor inside of it, playing from the situations very much in line with what we saw in Terminator 2. Along those same lines, Sarah Connor feels like Sarah Connor, except much older and with much more life experience, and she's an R-rated character, as she should be inside of this universe. Another great thing about this film is the premise itself. It gives a much better reason for its existence than Terminator 3 or Terminator Genesis did. And it creates a scenario where you get really good character arcs for Sarah Connor, for what they kind of do with Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator character. Now, I'm not going to go into any specifics, but the movie does make some big, bold choices in where they go with the mythology, and I thought that they really paid off and set up the characters nicely and gave them places to go that were interesting and different and unexpected, because you just knew that anything could happen inside of the story. Some people had messaged me before I saw it that they thought I would really hate some of this stuff. I didn't. I thought that it worked. It made sense. It felt like a proper continuation, and there's interesting ideas inside of it as you just stop and think of the implications of what happens and what they do with the characters. Because of all it, it worked for me. Of course, one of the big standouts here is, of course, Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor, and because of where she's at in life, this is kind of the most balanced in a certain sense that we've ever seen her, because we saw her at the beginning of the first film, just a little look into her life, and then she's swept away on this big adventure. And then in the second film, she is a little bit crazy in that movie and has to kind of regain her humanity throughout that film. Here, we're seeing her kind of settled into who she is, what her place is inside of the world, and so she's kind of the most likable that she's ever been, because she's just as tough as ever. It's not like she's a sweetheart or anything like that, but she has like this specific charm about her, the way that she interacts, the confidence that she just kind of oozes out of her in every single situation. It just makes her so much better of a character. It builds off all the greatness that was there before, and now we see her in this new phase of life. Loved what they did with her. And because of that premise that I can't really talk about, there's all kinds of stuff that the more I think about it, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. That's really cool what they did there and how it ties together and the different pieces to it. Like, there's things about this movie, and we'll talk about this in a bit, that are familiar to films that have come before, but there's a lot of great ideas inside of it that are really smart in what they do for the mythology of the world of the Terminators. Of course, another standout is Arnold Schwarzenegger as the T-800. Once again, they found a way to give him something new and different to do with the character. There's a great dynamic between him and Linda Hamilton in the film. Just wish you had a whole movie that was just 2 hours straight of them and their interactions back and forth. The dynamic between the two of them, it's so good. Arnold is so good in the role, and he keeps finding new layers to like stack on top of it that feel right and organic. And he's really funny in the movie without having to do kind of big, broad humor. It's built out of the scenarios that he's in and what this cyborg character would do in these instances. It all landed for me. You just love seeing Arnold do his thing inside of this movie, especially when he's interacting back and forth with Sarah Connor. Another nice touch inside of the film is that it's not set in LA. I wouldn't have thought that that would be a big advantage for the film going into it, but as soon as you have a Terminator movie that's not them going to the Griffith Observatory and all these places we've seen in all the previous films, but it actually starts in Mexico City and there's a journey throughout the film, and so we're going to Texas and all these different places, it gives the movie a different feel and vibe in a way that I think works really nicely. It just doesn't feel like SoCal, and that itself makes it so they can have certain elements that are very familiar inside of it while having a very different flavor in the way things play out, the scenarios that they're in, what the characters need to do. It just worked. And as it is a Terminator movie, you have to talk about the action, and it's all handled really nicely here. The shots are wide enough that you can see what's happening, and it's staged in a way that at times it just feels brutal. One of the things that stood out about it is that there's a lot of melee combat inside of the film where you have Arnold beating the new Terminator with a big stick. They use chains, there's a sledgehammer, they grab some rebar. There's a lot of actual like physical things that they're just beating each other over the head with, and it makes for exciting, visceral action in the film. Now, there's also no shortage of explosions and grenades and machine guns and kind of big spectacle sequences, but it's done in a way that there's a lot of these iconic shots that are just done really nicely. But really, the biggest praise I can give this film is that it didn't feel like fan fiction to me. I've only seen it one time, but one of the things I've said about Terminator 3, Salvation, and Genesis is that I can enjoy them, but I enjoy them as big budget fan fiction. They feel like they gave a bunch of money to someone that just really liked the Terminator and here, play in the sandbox, and then we got these movies, and I can enjoy watching someone play in that sandbox because I just love the mythology of the Terminator movies. There's just a little bit more depth and intelligence to how they're progressing things forward, why things are progressing forward, what's going on with this Grace character and Danny, how do they tie into everything. It doesn't feel as much like we're just rehashing things, even though in certain ways we have all the beats that you're supposed to have inside of a Terminator movie. It just feels on that next level up of like, this feels like a proper continuation of Terminator 2 and where things would go in an interesting way. With all that said, let's move on to the mixed aspects of the film. And the big thing here is what I just alluded to, is that this movie is kind of a mix of things from previous films inside of the franchise. It's a chase movie just like Terminator 1, 2, and 3. It has certain pieces of mythology from Terminator 3. It has other ideas from Terminator Genesis. And so some people will watch the movie and just be like, we're doing this again, another movie about two people being sent back in time, one good, one bad. But I would argue that it falls in line with the vibe of the first two movies, and it executes better ideas that were in Terminator 3 and in Genesis, and it does them in a way that's a lot more satisfying. It didn't just feel like a rehash to me, it felt like a continuation of the mythology, and because we're not set in LA, because of where things are at, the way things have changed, it felt like building upon what came before rather than just cycling back and doing it again. With that said, let's move on to the bad. The first thing that comes to mind is the movie sets up kind of like two mysteries inside the film to build intrigue as to where we're going. It has these big reveal moments, and when the reveal happens, you're like, well, yeah, I knew that. It's pretty obvious. You kind of telegraphed that 10 miles away. And it's the sort of thing that like the movie's not built around the mystery of these reveals, so there was no reason to build them as intrigue because there were such obvious plot points. Also, kind of the main girl being protected, Danny, feels very much like a side character, whereas all of her protectors in the film seem to get much bigger arcs than she has. She's kind of there. Not that she's a passive character, not that she's a weak character, not that she's played poorly. She's just not necessarily given as much of a front and center role, especially in the first two acts of the film. She's just kind of along for the ride in the background for a good bit at the beginning. Also, when it comes to the action, there's a bunch of stuff that I loved that they did. There's also a few things that I thought went a bit over the top. You can even see in the trailer these shots of jets flying and all over the place and cars parachuting down. That sequence even continues and it does something even a little bit more ridiculous than that. I wish they kind of dialed some of that back a little bit and gone more practical in how they'd done some of the big chase sequences there towards the end. Likewise, it seemed like there were a few overly obvious contrivances involved to try and fit the pieces together so all the characters would be at the same place at the same time. The explanation that they gave for how that happened and why it happened didn't exactly fully satisfy. And probably one of the biggest things working against this film is that it is meant to be a sequel to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, a film that many people consider to be the greatest action film of all time, and I wouldn't argue against that point. And what I think kind of holds this one back from kind of getting all the way up to some of the heights of that film is that that movie was really about something. It was exploring ideas about humanity. And this movie doesn't necessarily, it's not about something in as obvious and emotionally resonant of a way. It's a great continuation with the mythology. I think it does have a lot of really good emotional moments inside of it, but I don't think it functions on that deeper level of having something to say inside of it in a way that works like Terminator 2 did. Real quick before I give you my final score on this one, be sure to tell me what you thought down below in the comment section. Remember, if you want to talk specifics, put a gigantic spoiler warning so you don't spoil the movie for anyone. Also, I'm going to be posting a spoiler review this weekend. I'm going to do that with Cody Leach, and I'm also going to be ranking all of the Terminator movies that should drop on Friday, so come back in a few days for more Terminator discussion. If you can go into this movie without feeling burnt out by Terminator 3, Salvation, and Genesis, and you don't expect it to be as good as one of the greatest action movies of all time, I think you're gonna get the Terminator movie that you've been waiting for. I really dug it. It's an A-, it's an 8.5 on the entertainment scale, and I would say see it in the theater. I want a sequel to this Terminator movie. I wanna see where they're going with all of this fun stuff. Remember to come back in a few days for my Terminator ranking and my spoiler review of this movie. Also, if you want my spoiler reviews of the previous Terminator movies, it's in that playlist right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.